Welcome back to the deep dive. We often talk about the grand sweep of biblical history, the mighty kings, the covenant promises, the battles that changed the world.
We do. The big, obvious strokes on the canvas.
Exactly. But if you think of Scripture as this massive, incredibly detailed tapestry, sometimes the most crucial truths are found in the smallest threads, the ones that are woven in so tightly you could almost miss them.
Those names that appear just once and then seem to vanish.
That's it. And that's our focus today.
We're taking a true deep dive into one of the most obscure names, I think, in the entire Old Testament, the Gerizites.
The Gerizites. It's a name you find only once in 1 Samuel chapter 27, verse 8, and they're mentioned right alongside two other groups.
The Geshurites and, really critically, the Amalekites.
And here's the core takeaway right from the start for you.
Yeah.
The Gerizites. They aren't just some random geographical footnote. They actually function as a kind of political cipher.
A cipher, that's a good way to put it.
They help define the specific kind of conflict David was engaging in during, well, maybe the most formative and high-stakes season of his entire life.
I mean, this is when he's being hunted by Saul. He's establishing his first real command.
And ultimately, he is securing the southern borders of the kingdom God had promised him.
Exactly. So our mission today is to move past the dryness of just the name itself and to extract the key insights. We want to get a glimpse of the rough, sometimes brutal politics of the ancient Near East.
And through that lens, we can start to understand the steady, unshakable purposes of God.
Which we see outlined from the foundational law in, say, Deuteronomy 7, all the way through to the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel 7.
So this isn't going to be a lecture on ancient history. This is about giving thoughtful attention to the nuances of the text. It's about helping us, as adult Christians who wrestle with the complexities of this history, see how God works powerfully, even in the footnotes.
We're aiming for a conversation that's serious, but also warm and really focused on practical application.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. Where do we even begin to place the Gerizites on a map?
Well, we start with that single appearance. It's in 1 Samuel 27.8. The text simply says that David and his men went up and raided the Geshurites, the Gersites, and the Amalekites.
And you'll notice right away there are slight variations in the English spellings. Sometimes you'll see Gerzites or Gezrites. That can, confuse people a bit.
It can, but the stability of the meaning is what matters. The root of the name suggests these were a desert people.
Which immediately anchors them in a specific place.
The geography of the Negev.
And we really need to pause on the Negev, because when we say the Negev, it's so much more than just the south. This is a very specific, very harsh, and critically important environment.
Right. Think of it as this dry, transitional buffer zone. You have the relatively civilized, settled hill country of Judah to the north.
And then you have the massive ancient power of Egypt to the south, with its borders stretching toward the wilderness of Shur. The Negev is that tough land in between.
And I think we often forget just how difficult life was there. It wasn't, endless rolling dooms like in a movie. It was a place where your very survival hinged on specialized knowledge.
We're talking about a landscape that's sustained only by these scattered oases, some seasonal grazing lands, and especially the wadis.
The wadis are absolutely key. These are the dry riverbeds that only flood for a short time after these rare, intense rainfalls.
So you have to know where those water channels are. You have to know where the cisterns are that catch the rain.
And you have to know how to build and maintain these simple stone enclosures to protect your limited resources. The Negev was not a forgiving place.
And because of that harshness, it wasn't just a desolate border. It was also a kind of economic highway.
The trade tracks ran right through it, the routes connecting Egypt to the hill country.
So if you're a settled farmer living up in Judah, your peace, your safety, your economic well-being, it all depends on who controls that region to your south.
And that leads us to the foundational insight about the Gerizites and their neighbors. Whoever knew the wells, whoever mastered the passes through that landscape.
They could live right on the edge of the civilized world.
And cause an immense amount of trouble. That knowledge was power. And this conflict, it wasn't new in David's time. We see this contention over vital water resources going back for centuries.
It really provides context for so much of the biblical drama. We remember the patriarchs, Abraham and Isaac. They spent years contending over wells and pastures in that exact same dry region.
Constantly negotiating with or fighting the local powers that were there. Genesis 20, Numbers 21. It's a recurring theme. The fight over who owned the margin was foundational to Israel's entire history.
So with that geographical picture in mind, let's talk about the culture. Who were these people?
Well, the biblical narrator is highly intentional in how he introduces the Gerizites. He doesn't just name them in isolation.
No, they're immediately associated with two groups that Israel knew intimately.
Amalek and Geshur. And that association, it instantly defines the Gerizites' cultural strategy and, frankly, their threat level.
Let's focus on Amalek first, because they are. They're really the reference point for pure, relentless hostility.
Their history with Israel starts way back in the wilderness, right after the Exodus. And it's how they attack that's so telling. They don't meet Israel's main army head on.
No, they prey on the most vulnerable. The weary, the stragglers, the sick who fell behind the main group on the march.
That tactic defines who they are. They weren't fighting for land in that moment. It was about cruelty and exploitation. And because they attacked Israel at their absolute weakest point, God declared them a sworn existential enemy.
The law later specifies this. God mandates that their memory should be blotted out.
And the reason given is because they lacked basic moral restraint. They preyed on the helpless. So for Israel, Amalek represents this persistent, immoral threat to the peace and security of God's covenant people.
Okay, so that's Amalek. What about Geshur? They were present in that same general region, but maybe a slightly less focused long-term threat.
I think that's accurate. The Geshurites were one of these many non-Israelite pockets that are mentioned as living in the southern and eastern margins of the Promised Land, even after Joshua's conquest.
So they represent that constant, low-grade tension, these unassimilated people living right on the border.
They were just a fixture on the map, a constant reminder to Israel that they had not fully secured their territory.
So by naming the Gerizites right alongside Geshur and Amalek, the narrator paints a very clear picture for his original audience.
He's telling you exactly what kind of people they are. They weren't part of some massive organized empire. They were small, mobile, resilient desert tribes.
And they survived not through agriculture or settled life, but through calculated raiding.
Survival by extraction, that was their entire economic model. They knew the trade tracks, they knew the weak points of the settled villages.
They would harass villages on the Judean border, they would tax caravans moving between Egypt and the north.
Or they would just conduct a straight-up raid for livestock and goods. They were absolute masters of the hit-and-run strategy.
We see the system laid out so clearly in the book of Judges. With the Midianites and the Amalekites, they would just descend on the settled lands, sweep up all the crops and flocks.
And leave the Israelites utterly impoverished. It was a strategy of rule through terror and theft.
And this whole lifestyle, this culture was in direct contradiction to Israel's covenant law.
Absolutely. God's law explicitly warned Israel against adopting the practices and the idolatry of these surrounding peoples. Their creed was power, it was fear, it was theft.
So blending with them, adopting their gods, it risked this deep corruption of Israel's internal faithfulness.
So the Gerizites, they existed right on that contested space. They were both a physical danger and, I think, a profound spiritual temptation to adopt a life driven by self-reliance and violence instead of covenant faith.
Okay, so this cultural tension immediately informs the narrative when David enters the scene. And what a scene it is. David is the anointed king, but he's running for his life from Saul.
Right.
And he makes this desperate, incredibly complex political decision. He defects to the Philistine enemy.
He takes refuge with King Achish in Gath. It's a moment of just utter ambiguity in David's life.
And Achish grants him the town of Ziklag as his base of operations.
That town becomes a really strategic location for David's future. The sources even make a point of noting that Ziklag remained tied to the kings of Judah afterward.
But in that moment, David is operating deep inside enemy territory. He's beholden to an enemy king.
So from Ziklag, David begins to conduct these regular forays, and his targets are incredibly specific.
The Geshurites, the Gerizites, and the Amalekites.
Right. On the surface, it looks exactly like the kind of desert raiding that defined the culture of his enemies.
But this is where David's calculation elevates the action from just simple banditry. The biblical narrator highlights a grim and, frankly, a disturbing detail.
David did not leave a man or a woman alive to bring news to Gath.
That starkness is genuinely shocking when you first read it. We have to address the severity of that act. What's the explicit, immediate reason for that level of ruthlessness?
It's purely a calculated deception to protect his cover. You have to remember David's precarious political position.
If he left survivors.
If he left survivors, those people, the Gerizites or Amalekites, they would inevitably travel back toward Gath, and they would report the truth to King Achish.
The truth being that David was raiding Israel's historical enemies in the Deep South.
Not Israel's allies or Judah itself.
And Achish would immediately realize David was still loyal to Israel, not to the Philistines. His entire political refuge would collapse.
And it would likely cost him and all of his men their lives.
So when David reports back to Achish, his language is so careful it's strategically ambiguous.
Yes. Achish asks, "Where have you made a raid today?" And David reports that he raided against the Negev of Judah, or against the Negev of the Jeremielites, or against the Negev of the Kenites.
All of whom were either part of Judah or allies of Judah.
He's lying by strategic omission. He's allowing the Philistine king to draw the completely wrong conclusion.
And the deception works perfectly. Achish is convinced. He believes David has made himself utterly despicable, obnoxious to his people Israel.
He thinks David is now irrevocably his loyal servant for life.
This moment is just so deeply complex for a leader destined to be the king of God's people. On the one hand, he's engaged in a necessary political maneuver to save his life and the lives of his men and their families.
But on the other hand, in carrying out this ruthless deception, he is simultaneously fulfilling a larger covenant duty.
He's thinning the ranks of the ancient enemies of Israel. He's clearing out the southern margins, which will make the future borders of Judah far more secure.
The ambiguity here is profound. It demonstrates that leadership, especially in hostile settings, often involves making these difficult, ethically blurred tactical choices to secure a strategic, covenant-mandated outcome.
It shows a David who is balancing this shrewd political wisdom with his true underlying calling.
And the success of that deception is immediately tested. This is what sets the stage for the crucial moment in the story.
The Philistine forces muster to fight Saul, and King Achish wants David to join them.
But the other Philistine lords, they're wiser. They distrust him, and they demand that Achish send David and his men home.
So David leaves, and you can almost imagine him feeling a little bit smug. His manipulation of Achish worked. He avoided fighting his own people.
But the moment he returns to Ziklag, the bottom just drops out of his world.
He finds Ziklag burned to the ground. Their wives, their sons, their daughters, everything and everyone they valued had been captured and carried off by the Amalekites.
It's the ultimate proof. Despite David's constant raids, these desert enemies were still a devastating live threat. The work of securing the border is never truly finished.
And the emotional weight of this scene, it's often glossed over. The men who had followed David through years of hiding, who had been ruthless raiders themselves.
They were completely broken. The text says they wept until they had absolutely no strength left to weep.
And in their despair and grief, they turn on their leader. They start talking about stoning David.
This is the lowest point of his entire pre-kingship life. The distress isn't just external, it's existential. His own men, his inner circle, they want him dead.
The text says he was greatly distressed. But here is the pivot point. This is the essence of David's character that makes him the king God chose. But David found strength in the Lord his God.
And that phrase, found strength in the Lord his God, it's not passive. It describes an active, intentional act. He's anchoring his soul and his will in God in the midst of total collapse.
When everything he had built, his reputation, his strategy, his safety, was literally in ashes, he turned upward.
And it wasn't just guesswork or a vague feeling. It was a desperate, immediate, covenant-anchored response.
And that response is very specific. He doesn't just retreat to pray in silence. He immediately seeks the Lord's direction, using the established means of communication.
He calls for Abiathar the priest and for the ephod. This wasn't a casual prayer. This was a formal inquiry requiring the most sacred elements of the sanctuary.
And this is such a critical detail for you as a listener. David wasn't just relying on his gut feeling or his military experience. He was subordinating his strategy to God's explicit will.
He asks two very direct questions. Shall I pursue this raiding party? Will I overtake them?
And the divine answer, relayed through the priest, is a declaration of absolute certainty.
Pursue them. You will certainly overtake them and succeed in the rescue.
That certainty just changes the entire atmosphere. Despair turns into decisive action. David strikes the raiders. He recovers literally everything that was lost: wives, children, all the stolen goods.
And he immediately credits the Lord. He says, God is the one who has protected us and delivered into our hands the raiding party.
And this is where the Gerizites' explicit role in the narrative ends.
Their fate, already sealed by David's previous raids, is confirmed by this decisive action against their Amalekite associates. They disappear from the history books.
They were likely dispersed or absorbed into other groups.
Right. And their removal, along with the other harassing tribes, it accomplished a monumental task. It secured the southern flank of Judah. It created the necessary stability for David to finally be able to assume the throne in Hebron.
They were a small, necessary obstacle that had to be removed for the greater promise of the kingdom to be established.
So now we have to step back and address the big question for thoughtful believers.
hmm
How do we reconcile this violence, this process of removal, with the character of a loving, merciful God?
The story of the Gerizites forces us to look squarely at the theocratic framework of the Old Testament.
Right. The removal of the Gerizites, the Geshurites, and especially the Amalekites, it underscores a deeply serious theological truth. God's governance of Israel included the necessary judicial task of restraining and removing peoples whose persistent violence and idolatry threatened the very existence of the covenant community.
And this wasn't random conquest. The Bible is clear that it was judicial, and the rationale for this was established long, long before David's time.
Oh, absolutely. You look at passages like Deuteronomy 7, where God commanded Israel not to enter into covenants or show mercy to the specific nations whose practices would inevitably draw Israel's heart away from him.
And we also have to remember the promise given all the way back to Abraham in Genesis 15. God stated the conquest wouldn't happen immediately.
Because the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure.
That concept, full measure, is so key, and it really needs some elaboration, especially for a modern audience. What does the scripture mean by sin reaching its full measure?
Well, it implies a period of incredible divine forbearance. It means that God, who is just, waits. He waits until the wickedness of a people becomes so systemic, so entrenched, and so destructive.
We're talking about things like child sacrifice, pervasive sexual immorality.
Perpetual violence against the innocent. The sources really define this as a kind of moral cancer that, if it's left unchecked, would destroy the very environment needed for the line of the Messiah to emerge.
So David's actions, even while they were serving his political cover, they fit into this much larger, established theocratic framework of thinning out these perpetual aggressors like Amalek.
It was an act of national defense and covenant preservation executed by the king God had chosen.
And it requires us to hold the balanced attributes of God in tension. Scripture is wonderfully clear that God is compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love.
But those very same verses affirm that he does not leave the guilty unpunished. If God is perfectly good, he must eventually confront and stop evil that is actively devouring the weak.
And in the unique context of the Old Testament, where Israel was a literal, physical nation with boundaries and armies,
God's judgment often moved through human agents, through kings and military campaigns. And this was all vital for preserving the political and physical existence of the nation that would eventually give birth to the Messiah.
this brings us to a really crucial point of clarification for every thoughtful Christian today.
Yes. We have to apply what's often called a grammatical historical lens, or you could say a dispensational lens.
Or to put it more simply, we have to ask the question, was this a command for them back then, or is it a command for us today?
Because if we get the eras mixed up, the application of the Bible can become confusing or even dangerous.
Israel, under the Mosaic covenant, was uniquely designated by God as a nation-state. They had land, they had civil laws, and they had unique mandates that in specific instances included territorial war at God's explicit command.
The church age is fundamentally different, and the sources stress this distinction over and over. The church is a spiritual body, not a geopolitical state.
We are never, under any circumstances, authorized to wield the temporal sword, that is, literal military force, for the advancement of the gospel or for the removal of our spiritual enemies.
Our commission and our warfare were completely redefined by Christ. Our fight, Paul says, is not against flesh and blood.
The analogy is clear. We fight spiritual battles with spiritual weapons. The armor of God, truth, righteousness, prayer.
Not swords and spears.
Exactly. So David's raids against the Gerizites are historical instruction for us. They detail the difficult path God used to protect the line that led to Christ.
They are not prescriptive application for Christian action today. We read them to trust God's sovereignty over history, not to model our current evangelism or social engagement. That boundary marker is just essential for responsible biblical interpretation.
And this obscure appearance of the Gerizites, it also serves as this humble but potent reminder of God's complete universal rule.
It's a staggering thought. They only existed because God allowed it, and they vanished when his timeline required it. God isn't just focused on the affairs of Israel. He's intimately concerned with the affairs of every nation, every tribe.
You think of Paul addressing the Greeks in Acts 17. He explains that God marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands.
And that was true for the massive empires, and it was equally true for the nomadic Gerizites.
The ultimate takeaway there is that a name recorded in a single verse still answers to the Lord who raises up and brings down kingdoms, tribes, and leaders alike.
There is no person, no tribe, no conflict that falls outside the boundary of his sovereign plan.
And finally, this whole narrative arc ensures that God receives all the credit for the victory. We see it so clearly after the Amalekite defeat at Ziklag.
David had executed this brilliant pursuit, but when his men started squabbling over how to divide the spoil,
The greedy ones wanted to hoard the bounty for themselves.
David intervenes decisively. He corrects their self-serving pride by insisting that the recovered goods were not a product of their own strength, but a gift.
He says, "Do not do that, my brothers, with what the Lord has given us. He has protected us and delivered into our hands the raiding party that came against us."
That confession is the perfect fusion of strategy and theology. Leaders have to plan diligently. Armies have to march hard.
But the ultimate salvation, the final rescue, and the enduring success always belong to the Lord. We have to confess his hand when the dust settles, especially in our own lives.
So let's pivot from that historical complexity to the immediate practical reality of our lives today. If the Gerizites represent this small, persistent threat on Israel's margins, what does their story teach us about spiritual vigilance?
Well, the very obscurity of the Gerizites is our spiritual warning label. We tend to reserve our energy for confronting the Amalek, the big obvious sins or the massive public moral failures.
But the text reminds us that David had to constantly clear his southern border of these persistent, smaller raiders who knew exactly when to strike.
It's a great analogy for the spiritual life, isn't it? Our spiritual health is rarely undone by a single catastrophic public event.
Much more often, it erodes slowly and steadily because we neglect the margins.
So where are the Gerizites showing up on the edges of your life right now?
These are the small, tolerated enemies, the corrosive beliefs we allow to linger, the unnoticed compromises in our personal standards, the bad habits we indulge because they just seem too small to matter.
They aren't big enough to feel like a crisis, not yet. But they are mobile and they are persistent.
And these small, subtle enemies, they make faithfulness costly over time. They drain our strength, and they set us up for a much larger disaster, just as Ziklag was vulnerable when David was preoccupied elsewhere.
Wisdom, as Proverbs reminds us again and again, requires taking regular inventory at those margins, securing what remains, and strengthening defenses before a crisis flares up.
We have to be diligent about the small things because the enemy uses the small things to gain strategic ground. If David had neglected those smaller tribes entirely, the Amalekite destruction of Ziklag would have been far, far worse.
His previous actions, even the ethically murky ones, had thinned the enemy ranks. That's what made the eventual rescue even possible.
We are called to fight the small battles now so that we are not utterly overwhelmed when the big crisis comes.
And the setting of the Gerizites story, David's exile at Ziklag, is a perfect picture of the tension that all believers live in. The gap between a promise that has been given and the fulfillment that hasn't arrived yet. David was anointed king, but he was still running from Saul. He was operating in ambiguity and constant threat.
This is the nature of the Christian life. We have the sure promises of Christ, our sanctification, the certainty of his return. But we live in a difficult, messy world where obedience is hard and disappointment is very real.
And David's experience teaches us how to survive in that tension.
When the grief broke him open, when he was faced with the destruction of Ziklag and the threat of stoning, he learned to find strength by intentionally anchoring himself in God. It wasn't just a mood, it was a choice of posture.
And this pattern is so profoundly instructive for us. How do we strengthen ourselves in the Lord our God? It means being intentional about seeking his direction.
Not relying solely on our depleted emotional state or our own limited intellect. When distress hits, we have to use the resources he has given us, the scriptures, prayer, the counsel of godly people, to ask for wisdom and direction.
David called for the ephod. We turn to the Bible and to prayer.
And when the Lord answers that inquiry with mercy and with rescue, the practical application demands a response. And that response has to be rooted in radical gratitude and generosity.
David didn't just thank God. He shared the spoil. He set a standard that even those who were too exhausted to complete the march were to receive a full share of the recovery.
Our response to God's rescue must be the same. It has to be outward and overflowing. We are called to share the blessings, the resources, and the wisdom we receive with those who are weak, or weary or struggling around us.
We cannot hoard the spoils of a victory God gave us.
Let's look again at David's guarded speech with Achish. He had to conceal the truth of his raids to survive in the Philistine court. It raises these tough questions about integrity and how we navigate hostile settings.
And the sources are careful here to prevent a misapplication. This is certainly not a license for everyday deceit or casual manipulation.
But it is a necessary reminder that wisdom, in a fallen world, sometimes requires extremely careful speech or silence or strategic omission when you're dealing with those who are actively hostile to the kingdom of God.
It's the tension inherent in Jesus' instruction to his disciples. Be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. How do you remain innocent in your heart while being strategically shrewd in your execution?
The goal defines the method. The goal is never manipulation for personal gain. It's the protection of the innocent and the advancement of God's name. Our shrewdness has to always be measured by our innocence.
Walking wisely and harmlessly so that the character of Christ is honored and the mission isn't unnecessarily imperiled.
And this applies to leadership across the board, whether you lead a home, a business, or a church ministry. David's experience compels leaders to guard the edges of their stewardship, just as he guarded the southern border of the future kingdom.
A good leader has to know where the raiders come from and has to secure the weak points.
And critically, a good leader has to manage the internal culture, not just the external threats. David had to correct the spiritual pride of the men who wanted to hoard the victory for themselves.
The ones who went out to fight.
Right. He established a clear, generous statute. Those who held the baggage, those who provided the logistics and the support, were to be honored equally with those who fought the battle.
That is a phenomenal application for the church today. It mandates a culture where every single part of the body, every member, is honored, regardless of their public visibility or their role.
Victory is shared because Christ is the head and the giver of all success. There is absolutely no room for spiritual elitism when the victory belongs to the Lord.
And finally, we have to return to that initial uncomfortable truth of the judgment scenes, represented by the removal of the Gerizites. Why must we not stumble over these hard texts?
Because they remind us of the sheer weight and consequence of sin. They remind us that God is actively involved in stopping wickedness that devours the poor and sets itself up against holiness.
For the thoughtful Christian, the application is clear, though it's challenging. We are not commanded to take up the temporal sword,
but to take up the gospel. Resisting evil with persistent good, praying for our enemies, and ultimately trusting that the judge of all the earth will always do right, even when his timing or his methods are opaque to us.
When we encounter a difficult text, like the swift removal of the Gerizites, we have to intentionally look through that historical judgment to the cross of Christ.
Because the cross is the sole intersection where perfect justice and infinite mercy met.
There, the Son of David, the true king, bore the full weight of God's wrath against sin so that all nations, even those formerly arrayed as enemies of God, could find reconciliation and redemption by faith.
The judgment of the Gerizites helped clear the way for the physical kingdom. The judgment at the cross opened the way for the spiritual, eternal kingdom. And that final perspective transforms how we understand every single small thread woven into the scriptures.
The story of the Gerizites, it just flickers across a single verse, defining the edges of David's conflict. But its function is crucial. Their defeat was part of the process that secured God's people and protected the promises.
They remind us that opposition does not stand forever, and that the Lord watches the borders of his people, teaching us to do the same in our spiritual lives.
And this history, it ultimately draws our eyes forward to the greater David, Jesus Christ.
He secured his kingdom not by desert raids from Ziklag, but by the ultimate self-sacrifice on the cross and the power of the empty tomb. He's gathering people from every single nation, every tribe, tongue, and Gerizite, and holding them fast until all enemies are finally and permanently under his feet.
Trust him, even in the margins of your life, in those small, persistent struggles that threaten to wear you out.
Let's just revisit that anchor passage, 1 Samuel 30, verses 6 through 8. It captures the entire spirit of David's dependence on God during his absolute crisis point at Ziklag.
David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. But David found strength in the Lord his God.
Then David said to Abiathar the priest, "Bring me the ephod." Abiathar brought it to him, and David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I pursue this raiding party? Will I overtake them?"
"Pursue them," he answered. "You will certainly overtake them and succeed in the rescue."
The central encouragement from this whole story, from the Gerizites and from Ziklag, is this. When you are distressed, when you are weary, and when the future feels utterly ambiguous, strength, clear divine direction, and success and rescue are found not by turning inward, but by intentionally seeking the Lord your God.
May you, in the midst of life's complex struggles and its uncertainties, find your strength anchored firmly in the Lord, and may you trust His promises as He infallibly guides your path. Go deep, and God blesses.